Okay, here we go. Introduction to Philosophy, section on ethics. Looking at the difference, big picture, between John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism and Immanuel Kant's Deontology. Utilitarianism is a kind of ethics that emphasizes or focuses on the consequences of our actions, and Kant's Deontology focuses on the action itself, which is what that word means if you break it down from the thing itself. The question here is, how much do consequences matter? So it's actually worth taking a little bit to write on this and think about. You might even be able to assign it a percentage if you're thinking about a spectrum. Are consequences 100% important? So intentions, what goes into the action itself, if it doesn't actually produce good consequences, it's not a good action. So are consequences 100%? Or is it 100%, it's just on the action itself and consequences don't matter at all? So you think that consequences are the only thing that matters? Or that consequences don't matter at all? Or how much so? Is it like, maybe actually 30% is consequences and 70% of the action is what it is of itself? What seems more important to you already? And why? And then we are in position to kind of look, we're going to look at utilitarianism first. And the idea that if it is consequences, we need to be able to measure the consequences. So we should be able to say, at least in some ways, whether or not our consequences are good or not. So a good action would be one that produces good consequences. What are good consequences? Mill comes along and says that this is pleasure and pain. And now, as good philosophers, we need to make sure that we define our terms. So we should define what pleasure and pain is. And John Stuart Mill actually revises early. Jeremy Bentham was the first credited real utilitarianism that basically says all beings desire a certain kind of pleasure and all beings want to avoid a certain kind of pain, or all different types of pain. So anything that reduces pain and suffering and promotes pleasure and good states of being would be good. Mill thought this needed to expand this idea and talked about the different types of pleasures and pain, and usually in class I would like to play a kind of family feud to see if you can guess what John Stuart Mill's levels of pleasure and pain. So what types of pleasure, one being the most powerful type of pleasure, four being the least powerful type of pleasure, but still. Family feud guesses. Did I get happiness as like the highest one? I'm close, we'll go with that. Moral pleasure. Is what he says is the most significant and highest pleasure, followed by intellectual pleasure, followed by emotional pleasure, and then followed by the last one is like, well, where's food and sex go on this? Well, it's down here. Appetitive. I wanted to draw this out because it actually betrays or reveals some of the long-standing philosophical assumptions that we've encountered in this class, namely from Plato. And I wonder if I could draw a little picture of a cave over here and make a divided line between the mind and the body, and if we're going to be. So it's still in that world where we're thinking about pleasure and pain in terms of the different potentially levels of our being and how that works. So this is super interesting to me in the sense that if the greatest thing any one of us could ever do, and this is probably worth noting, it's the next thing on the note, we basically have the greatest happiness principle, which is, oh boy, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. All beings are equal, and actually a really good point of a check mark of why utilitarianism is a good philosophy is this is one of the first ones in European world that explicitly leaves room for animals and not just human beings, because animals are able to have pleasure and pain. So if you just kick a dog, that's not good. Why? Because it results in pain. And traditionally we could critique a lot of the philosophy we studied as being very human-centric, focused on humans in particular, and this one opens up the way for other beings, not just humans, to be involved in our ethics, which seems like a requirement, if you ask me. Okay. So this is utilitarianism, and what else is great about it is it's super simple. It seems super easy to apply, but there's problems that go along with it. And there's the good example, Jim and the indigenous people in the crash course video, and also the case of whether or not we could harvest one person's organs to save 5 other people. If we should do those kinds of calculations, which is the other word I wanted to put up here. This theory has been called a kind of hedonic calculus. Hedonism is, that's for pleasure, so it's basically like a pleasure calculus. And if you've ever tried to make a positive and negative list when you're assessing, should I do this or not? Should I get a new place to live or not? And you think, if I go, what's the results going to be? If I stay, what's the results going to be? What's going to be good, bad, long-term, short-term? You've been acting in accordance to utilitarianism, and to Mill's credit, he thinks they're just basically putting down what is natural and what we would want, what any being would want. So therefore, it's a good foundation for an ethical theory. However, there seems to be some problems with this. For me, it seems like if I'm measuring measuring an action based on its consequences, there are situations that are going to require horrible things, and maybe that's what needs to happen. But it also seems like if I do a good thing and the consequences don't pan out, or if I do a bad thing and the consequences pan out, that just seems it seems like we need more. It seems like we need a kind of internal reason why an action is good or bad, regardless of the consequences, especially if we can't control the consequences, or the consequences are out of our control and the scope of our choice. So how can we have a foundation for an ethical theory that is not in the consequences, but in the action itself? Well, we can look to Immanuel Kant, who I always marvel at how neat his solution to this is. It's just so simple and powerful. His question is how to measure, again, interestingly, the action itself, and he ends up saying that it is the intention and the kind of internal logic of the action itself. It is the will that I have to do something, which, interesting side note, that's how the Buddha defines karma, as intentional action. So you're only accruing karma when you're intending things to happen. I want this video to help you. I I hope that this is going to help. That's good karma because I'm wanting to help. I'm wanting to do this because it makes me look good. Maybe not as good of an intention. And maybe not as good of internal logic. What does that mean? He basically says there are certain things that we must do at all times in all places. There is a certain logic that must apply at all times, and in the sense in all situations. This is the sense that it is categorical, is where this word comes from. It is our duty to act in this way at all times, and we must do it, as in it is imperative. So Kant issues an idea that there is something we should do, need to do at all times, that has to do with the quality of our intention and our internal logic if we are going to do good things. If the action itself is going to be good, regardless of the consequences. And he ends up coming with, his answer is this categorical imperative. And it is act according to that maxim, that you can will become a universal law of nature. So act according to the rule that you can follow, that you would hope that it would become a universal law of nature. Can you take your action and universalize it and imagine everyone doing it? Would you want to live in that world? That's the rule you have to follow. I call this the golden rule on steroids. Which means this is the sense that treat other people like you want to be treated. You not only treating other people like you want to be treated, you're acting like you want other people to act in similar situations. So you're basically acting out the world that you want to live in. There is another formulation of this that is called the humanity principle, that is basically always treat other people as an end in themselves, never as a means only, which I'm going to paraphrase as don't use people. And this is a huge lesson from the course, I think, in the sense that there's multiple ways that you could use someone, even applying them a category in your mind and treating them as such. Because of that category, you are, in a sense, using them for your own means. And this has to do with, interestingly, consent and choice. That our ability to choose makes us the type of being that should not be used. This is what makes slavery wrong, regardless of the consequences. And all kinds of social agreements, and this connects to the social contract in an interesting way, all kinds of social agreements, we agree to be used in small ways. So, but it's our choice to. You want to avoid a situation where you're using another person, and that Kant says that is basically going to apply for everything. Very interesting. I wonder about other life in here. Again, Kant's view as a European in the 18th, 7th century is very human-centric. So he doesn't really, I think there's really good questions over here as well in terms of how this relates to other life forms and other kind of ecological considerations. But in any case, this is one of the oldest and most historical debates in ethics, so we're going to spend time on each of them, and hopefully by the end you can kind of adjust what you initially said, how much you think. Which, if you're a pragmatist, you would ask which one works best for you. which is the way I kind of like to approach this. And I said that I would end with a story, or I tried to say that I was going to end with a story. This is one of my favorite pieces of advice or consideration that I give myself and also give students who come to me trying to make a decision, whether or not to go to grad school or not, whether or not to move somewhere or not, kind of how do I choose what to do? And I think it's clarifying to ask, maybe it doesn't matter what you do. Maybe it matters more why you do it. So why would you go? And maybe there's room to grow as a human being in really investigating the intentions behind our actions and seeing if there's a better world that we would want to live in, and then acting that way. I think it's a really clarifying way. And personally for me, I'm really drawn to this idea that the action itself has a certain kind of integrity, regardless of the pleasure and pain. And paradoxically, again, I think this is got to be some kind of a spectrum, which is what the rule utilitarians kind of put in motion. That there are rules that we follow, internally so, to help make sure that over time we're doing things that create the greatest happiness or the greatest moral pleasure for the greatest number of people, which is hopefully what this video could do for you. And thinking about not only what we do and the consequences of it, but why we do what we do and the internal logic of our decision-making process. Since that's what makes us human being, and that is the foundation of ethics, is our choice. Okay. I wish I could call on you. So you have to just put your questions in the comments. All right, bye-bye now.